Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.
Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to take the last call on the first reading on this very important bill. And for less experienced colleagues in the House, I think it's fair to say it's not that unusual that peace breaks out around much of the government legislation. And indeed, there are many times when the Greens will support the government on certain bits of legislation. And indeed, New Zealand First, although it's extremely hard to tell sometimes, certainly from their speeches. We've heard some really interesting discourse, though, throughout this first reading speech. And I want to touch on issues that were raised by both Messrs Chevelle and Goff, at least in my listening, and then Ms Gender right at the end here, about this apparent causation with the correlation between sentencing and reoffending. Now, Mr Goff, I think, used the following statistics, and I trust that they are correct. 22% of offenders on community sentences reoffend, and 50% of offenders on short prison sentences reoffend. The inference then is that the shorter the sentence, the less the likelihood of the reoffending. And he said, quote, "We need to use sentences that work." Well, that's absolutely right, Mr Bridges. What we're actually talking about is not a scientific study where the scale of the offending is equal in each case. It's actually an insult to the justice system to suggest that for the same level of offending, some will get community sentences and some will get prison sentences. Well, that member may be better off going and speaking to that inexperienced member, Mr Goff, because frankly, it is absolutely spurious to suggest that less is better automatically when it comes to sentencing, because that's what we've heard in some of the contributions tonight. The simple fact is, the greater the level of offending, the greater the sentence. And the very important responsibility that this House has, and then the judiciary, is to ensure that the punishment fits the crime. And that those three principles, four actually if you count the deterrent factor, that Mr Titakatani mentioned, are actually achieved. So I do wonder what a community sentence would be given for. And members on the other side might be interested in this. Perhaps theft, for example, might warrant a community sentence. Perhaps receiving stolen property and passing it on when that authorisation hasn't been granted. I don't know, maybe assault or fighting in a public place where diversion clearly hasn't worked with the particular individual. So I think there are certain members on the other side who need to read this bill very, very carefully and take some heed, because there is a degree of recidivism in some offenders where community sentences simply won't be appropriate again in the future. Mr Speaker, I support this bill.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Administration of Community Sentences and Orders Bill, first reading.
The question is that the Administration of Community Sentences and Orders Bill be considered by the Law and Order Committee. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Call on Government Order of the Day number 4.